Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 09, Episode 20, where we crack open Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern World History to explore the complex and often tumultuous path of China since 1949. The Communists in Control. Our mission today is really to cut through the noise, navigate the defining moments of China's post-1949 history. We're talking about, everything from the initial struggles under Mao Zedong through the dramatic economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping and right up to the fascinating challenges facing China in the early 21st century. Our goal, as always, is for you to walk away with a quick yet thorough understanding, feeling truly well-informed about this incredibly impactful period.
Absolutely. And our primary source for this deep dive is Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern World History. It's an excellent choice because it offers a comprehensive overview of this pivotal period, bringing together the commonly understood narratives. With, as we'll soon discover, some quite shocking revelations from more recent historical research. It really helps us connect the dots across decades of change.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What was the landscape like when Mao Zedong took power in 1949? What were the immediate priorities?
Well, Mao inherited an utterly devastated nation. China had been shattered by years of civil war and brutal war with Japan. Infrastructure was in ruins, railways, roads, canals, you name it. Food was scarce, industry was primitive, agriculture really inefficient. And inflation was just spiraling out of control. It was a Herculean task, frankly, to bring order to a country of 600 million people. Now, he did have significant popular support from the peasants and even some middle class who were just fed up with the previous nationalist government, the Kuomintang.
Right, so a massive undertaking. And how did Mao begin to tackle such immense challenges, particularly in terms of, governance?
His initial approach was surprisingly pragmatic, actually. He studied Stalin's methods closely, but adapted them through trial and error to fit China's unique situation. The 1950 Constitution, which was officially adopted in '54, established the National People's Congress as the supreme legislative body, alongside a state council and a chairman of the republic. But crucially, while these bodies aimed to ensure smooth administration, they were all dominated by the Communist Party. Only party members could actually stand for election. What's fascinating here, though, is that after decades of instability, this centralized system did provide China with a strong central government, bringing a much-needed sense of stability.
That stability was certainly needed, especially when you look at agriculture. Mao set out to transform China's land, didn't he? From small private farms into large cooperative ones. What did that process look like?
Yeah, from 1950 to 1956, Mao spearheaded the collectivization of agriculture. The initial stage involved land being taken from large landowners and redistributed to peasants. This was a massive undertaking and, this is where historical accounts really start to diverge dramatically. Some earlier sources suggest immense violence, mentioning maybe as many as 2 million people killed during this process. However, some historians from the 1970s, like Jack Gray, claim there was, and I quote, remarkable attention to legality and minimum physical violence.
Wow, that's a stark difference in interpretation, a huge difference. So what does more recent scholarship tell us about this period?
Well, this is where it gets quite disturbing. New findings, particularly from Professor Frank Decatur, who accessed declassified Chinese archives after the 2008 Beijing Olympics, paint a much grimmer picture. His research reveals that the official accounts often, exaggerated achievements and downplayed the grim realities. In many areas, land was taken even from ordinary peasants, not just wealthy landowners, and given to Communist Party officials. And this was apparently done with considerable violence, torturing, and execution. There's one chilling document from the Hebei archives reporting. When it comes to the ways in which people are killed, some are buried alive, some are executed, some are cut to pieces, and among those who are strangled or mangled to death, some of the bodies are hung from trees or doors. Just horrific stuff. So by 1956, yes, most surviving peasants were indeed in collective farms, but the human cost in many regions seems to have been devastating.
Beyond agriculture, China also embarked on massive industrialization. How successful was that initial push?
The government nationalized most businesses and launched the 1953 five-year plan, focusing heavily on heavy industry, iron, steel, chemicals, coal. Russia provided significant aid with cash, equipment, and advisors. And this plan did see considerable success in industrial output, helping the country recover from the war's devastation. Inflation was brought under control, the economy began to stabilize. But interestingly, even before the plan was complete, Mao himself expressed doubts about relying too heavily on this Soviet-style heavy industrialization for China.
Right, he was already thinking about a different path, and that healthier economy, ironically, seemed to set the stage for one of Mao's most controversial initiatives. The 100 Flowers campaign in 1957, what was that all about?
It was a really fascinating moment. Industrialization had created this new class of technicians and experts, right? And Mao, perhaps feeling confident in the government's progress, called for constructive criticism. His famous phrase was, "Let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend." The idea supposedly was to improve relations between these experts and the party cadres, the officials who ran the country. However, the criticism that came back was far, far more severe than Mao anticipated. People attacked officials for incompetence. They denounced government over-centralization. Some even suggested that opposition parties should be allowed. This unexpected backlash quickly convinced Mao of the need to consolidate socialism. He swiftly clamped down on his critics, ending the campaign. It was a stark revelation, really, of the depth of opposition to communist rule even then.
And it led directly into what's known as the Great Leap Forward in 1958. How did Mao envision this next phase of development? What was the thinking?
Mao felt China needed a unique, ambitious approach to rapidly boost both agricultural and industrial output, something not based on the Russian experience. The Great Leap Forward had two incredibly ambitious and, well, ultimately devastating key features. First, the introduction of communes. These were much larger than the previous collective farms, sometimes containing tens of thousands of people. They were meant to act as self-sufficient local governments with their own farms and factories. Second, Mao envisioned decentralized, small, rural factories, particularly for producing steel in what he famously called backyard steel furnaces. The goal was a rapid, mass-driven transformation across the entire country.
But this grand vision, as you said, quickly turned into a catastrophic failure. What were the immediate consequences?
Oh, the consequences were immediate and devastating. There was widespread opposition to the communes themselves. This was coupled with a series of severe bad harvests from 1959 to 1961. And to make matters much worse, Russia withdrew all its aid due to the growing Sino-Soviet split. This combination, along with, frankly, a lack of experience among many cadres running things, caused immense hardship. Official statistics later emerged, suggesting something like 20 million premature deaths resulted, primarily from a disastrous famine. Mao's prestige suffered significantly. It forced him to step down as chairman of the People's Congress, although he did remain party chairman.
20 million. Even the official figure is horrifying. And this brings us to one of the most shocking aspects of this period, revealed by those newly accessible historical records. What did Professor Decatur's research uncover about the true extent of the catastrophe?
Decatur's work, his massive and detailed dossier from those archives, paints a picture far, far grimmer than previously understood. It's truly chilling. It includes reports of peasant resistance, mass murders, and even confessions from leaders who admitted responsibility for millions of deaths. Working conditions were just horrific. Decatur concludes that Mao was responsible for the premature deaths of at least 45 million people between 1958 and 1962. 45 million. And crucially, it wasn't just starvation. He estimates between 2 and 3 million victims were tortured to death or summarily killed, often for the slightest infraction. There are these harrowing examples, like a local box forcing a father to bury his own son alive for stealing a handful of grain. And perhaps most chillingly, Mao himself at one meeting is reported to have said something like, "It is better to let half the people die so that the other half can eat their fill." It just underscores the terrifying human cost when ideology completely overrides basic human concerns.
Despite this horrific immediate impact, the official narrative in China for a long time presented the Great Leap Forward as having significant long-term successes. What was that perspective? How did they frame it?
Well, the official line, for decades really, was that by the early 1970s, China's agricultural and industrial production had rebounded. They claimed the country was finally able to feed its population without famine. Communes were touted as successful units of local government, fostering a labor-intensive economy. Claimed benefits included the spread of education and welfare, a significant reduction in infant mortality, and even improved women's rights.
Okay, so that was the official story. But how does that narrative stand up to more recent independent assessments like Fenby's?
It doesn't stand up well at all, frankly. Jonathan Fenby, a leading expert on Chinese affairs, argues forcefully that by the time Mao died in 1976, he had brought the country to its knees, and China was virtually bankrupt. Fenby's research suggests that poverty was actually institutionalized. Much of the country remained pre-industrial. Productivity had slumped dramatically, and urban wages were apparently half what they had been before the revolution under the nationalists. He even notes major health issues like 90% of army recruits in Guangdong being rejected for poor physical condition. Essentially, if there was equality in the People's Republic, it was, in Fenby's very stark words, the equality of poverty.
That makes the next chapter, the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1969, seem even more bewildering. Why on earth did Mao launch such a disruptive campaign after everything that had happened?
It seems Mao saw this as his last stand, perhaps, an attempt to keep the revolution on what he considered a pure Marxist-Leninist course. He worried that ideas favoring incentives and managerial experts, particularly those promoted by his deputy Liu Shaoqi, were leading China down the capitalist road. So it was a desperate campaign for Mao to try and save the revolution by appealing directly to the masses, particularly young people. These became the Red Guards. They toured the country carrying their little red books of Mao's thoughts, closing schools and factories, urging youth to go work in the countryside.
And this fervent energy, it just unleashed pure chaos, didn't it? What were the consequences of the Red Guards' actions?
Total chaos is right. Once roused, the Red Guards denounced and often physically attacked anyone in authority, teachers, professionals, local party officials, you name it. Millions were disgraced, their lives ruined. By 1967, the extremists were almost completely out of control. Mao, apparently acknowledging mistakes privately, eventually had to call in the army, which was commanded by Lin Biao at the time, just to restore some semblance of order. Publicly, though, he blamed his advisors and various Red Guard leaders, leading to many arrests and executions.
And there was even a subsequent falling out with Lin Biao, who Mao had designated as his successor. What happened there?
Yeah, that's another murky episode. Mao later accused Lin Biao of being responsible for the Red Guard excesses. Some sources suggest Lin was basically made a scapegoat, perhaps because he was allegedly trying to maneuver Mao into retirement. Lin died in a mysterious air crash in 1971 while supposedly fleeing to the USSR. Regardless of the specifics, the Cultural Revolution caused immense disruption, ruined millions of lives, and set China's economic development back by probably a full decade. The country was, as Jonathan Fenby put it, essentially laid low by his experiments.
A truly grim legacy indeed. Yet, in a surprising pivot during Mao's final years, he and Zhu Enlai made the strategic decision to improve relations with the USA. How did that shift pave the way for the post-Mao era?
Well, that strategic shift certainly laid some important groundwork. After Mao's death in 1976, a power struggle immediately erupted. You had Hua Guofeng, Mao's chosen successor, Deng Xiaoping, who'd been sidelined previously for being too liberal, and the radical Gang of Four, led by Mao's widow, Jiang Qing. The gang attempted a coup, apparently, but Hua used that as a pretext to have them arrested. Hua then launched his own ambitious economic plan, but it quickly failed. Deng Xiaoping, who'd been very shrewdly biding his time, seized this opportunity. By June 1981, Hua was out, and the 73-year-old Deng became the undisputed leader of China.
Deng certainly had a tough road getting there, and clearly a vision for change, deeply shaped by his own experiences during those turbulent years. What was his approach?
Robert Service described Deng as hard as teak, which seems apt. He noted Deng's many demotions and promotions under Mao. Service also highlighted the deeply personal toll of the Cultural Revolution on Deng. His own son was crippled trying to escape physical maltreatment. So this background absolutely fueled Deng's determination for rapid, pragmatic change. He knew he had no time to waste.
And he immediately began reversing course. What were the first steps he took to signal this change?
As a very clear signal, the Gang of Four were put on trial. They were accused of evil, monstrous, and unpardonable crimes during the Cultural Revolution and eventually sentenced to life imprisonment. More broadly, the Communist Party itself publicly condemned the Cultural Revolution, calling it a grave left error and placing the primary responsibility on Mao himself. This was a really crucial move politically. It shifted blame from the party's collective leadership onto a single figure, which helped ensure the party's continued authority.
So, with the past formally acknowledged, at least in that way, what were the dramatic policy changes Deng implemented, especially on the economic front?
Starting around June 1978, Deng began systematically reversing many Cultural Revolution measures. Revolutionary committees were abolished, confiscated property was returned, and there was a noticeable increase in religious and intellectual freedom, though within limits, of course. Economically, Deng and his protégés, Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziying, were very active. They sought technical and financial help from the West, accepted loans, signed contracts with foreign companies, and even joined the IMF and World Bank in 1980. Domestically, they permitted private industrial companies, gave state farms more control, encouraged bonuses and profit sharing, paid higher prices to farmers for their produce, and cut taxes. And these measures brought pretty immediate success. Grain output hit record levels in 1979, and many peasants actually started becoming genuinely prosperous for the first time in decades.
But as often happens with reform, right, initial successes can lead to demands for even more radical change. And this played out vividly with the democracy wall movement. Tell us about that.
It's exactly. In November 1978, a poster campaign kicked off in Beijing, initially supporting Deng, but it quickly escalated. By 1979, the posters on this democracy wall grew much bolder. They weren't just supporting Deng anymore. They were criticizing Chairman Mao himself and demanding a whole range of human rights. Things like the right to criticize the government, non-communist representation in the People's Congress, freedom to change jobs and travel, and even the abolition of the communes.
That's a huge escalation. And how did Deng respond to these demands getting so, well, radical?
Deng was reportedly infuriated. He had only initially approved the democracy wall as a way to criticize the Gang of Four, his rivals. Now it had turned on the party itself. He launched a fierce attack on the dissidents, accusing them of trying to destroy the socialist system. Many were arrested and handed long prison sentences, up to 15 years in some cases. By November 1979, the democracy wall was abolished completely. Law and party discipline were swiftly reasserted. Deng's stance was crystal clear. Without the party, China will retrogress into divisions and confusions. For him, economic choice absolutely did not mean political choice.
Despite that crackdown, Deng and his protégés, Hu Yaobang and Zhao Zhang, remained determined to push ahead with modernization. What did that look like on the ground, particularly in agriculture?
Well, Zhao Ziyang, who was known for his administrative brilliance, really spearheaded experiments to break up the communes. The idea was to give peasants control of individual plots of land. Now, the land technically remained state-owned, but individual households could keep most of the profits from what they grew. This significantly boosted agricultural production and really improved living standards for many in the countryside. It went so far that by December 1984, the government even abandoned the compulsory state purchase of crops, allowing prices for surplus produce to fluctuate on the open market.
But these moves toward what they called market socialism, they weren't without their side effects, were they? There were bumps in the road.
No, definitely not. They certainly had their unfortunate side effects, as Lowe puts it. By 1984, imports had soared, leading to a significant trade deficit and a sharp fall in China's foreign exchange reserves. Inflation also began to climb rapidly, reaching 22% by 1986. Yet Deng, then in his 80s, seemed completely unfazed. His core philosophy remained incredibly simple. To get rich is not a crime. He aimed to double China's production and substantially raise average incomes. He called for sweeping decentralization in industry, for the party to actually withdraw from day-to-day administrative tasks. And he emphasized again and again the necessity of capitalist investment to create a prosperous, modernized state. Deng was absolutely convinced nothing could alter the course he had set.
But even Deng's clever balancing act, juggling reformers and hardliners, faced a severe test in 1987. What happened then?
Right, things got tense. Student demonstrations erupted again in December 1986. They supported the economic modernization, the four modernizations, but they were also demanding more democracy. Deng decided to disperse them, likely to avoid antagonizing the hardliners in the party. This led to the forced resignation of Hu Yaobang, who was seen as too liberal. He was replaced as party general secretary by Zhao Ziyang, who was more of an economic reformer. However, the hardliner Li Peng became prime minister, and he was pushing for a much stronger clampdown on any protest. This period really starkly highlighted that central dilemma. Could China actually offer economic choice without also offering political choice? Many observers, even Gorbachev over in the USSR at the time, thought it was impossible.
And that dilemma just exploded into a full-blown crisis in Tiananmen Square starting in April 1989. What fueled these renewed demonstrations?
Economic problems were definitely a major factor. Inflation was hitting really high levels, around 30%, and wages were stagnating, especially for state employees. People were feeling the pinch. Students, likely emboldened by Gorbachev's political reforms in the Soviet Union and his upcoming visit to Beijing, began renewed demonstrations right there in Tiananmen Square. Their demands were clear: political reform, democracy, and an end to the rampant Communist Party corruption. Zhao Ziyang initially showed some sympathy, even allowing press coverage for a while, which apparently outraged Deng. The demonstrations just grew and grew, sometimes involving hundreds of thousands of people occupying the square right through Gorbachev's visit and into June.
The scene on the ground must have been incredibly powerful, filled with so much hope. How did it feel to those witnessing it? Can you paint a picture for us?
John Simpson of the BBC described it vividly. He talked about a new spirit of courage and daring and a sense of liberation. He noted that the gentleness, the smiles, and the headbands were irresistibly reminiscent of the big rock concerts and the anti-Vietnam demonstrations in the 1960s. People were delivering food, ordinary citizens generously supplied water, and there was this widespread belief, he said, that victory seemed a foregone conclusion. People filled the avenues, cheering and singing. It really must have felt like a major turning point was happening.
But that hope, that energy was just brutally extinguished, wasn't it?
Yes. Tragically, yes. Behind the scenes, a fierce power struggle was raging within the Politburo between Zhao Ziyang, the reformer, and the hardline Prime Minister Li Peng. Li Peng ultimately won Deng Xiaoping's crucial support. On May 20th, Deng declared martial law. When negotiations inevitably failed, thousands of troops were brought into Beijing. On June 3rd and 4th, 1989, the army, using paratroopers, tanks, and infantry, attacked the students in and around the square. Estimates vary, but Lowe suggests they killed somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 of them. Tiananmen Square was brought back under government control, other demonstrations across China were brutally suppressed, and protest leaders received long prison sentences. Zhao Ziyang was removed from power and replaced by Jiang Zemin.
The condemnation from around the world was immediate and harsh. But how did Deng and the Chinese leadership justify their actions? What was their rationale?
Deng and the hardliners were absolutely convinced they had made the right decision. They argued that giving in to demands for democracy would have caused too much disruption and confusion. Chaos, basically. They believed firmly that one-party control was essential to supervise the transition to what they were now calling a socialist market economy. And here's where it gets truly interesting, historically speaking. Later events in the USSR seemed, from their perspective, to prove them right. Mikhail Gorbachev tried to introduce economic and political reforms simultaneously, right? Glasnost and perestroika. And his efforts failed spectacularly, leading to the collapse of the Communist Party and the breakup of the entire Soviet Union. So the Chinese leadership could look at that and, from their viewpoint, congratulate themselves on avoiding Gorbachev's mistakes and preserving communism in China, albeit a very different form of it.
Following Tiananmen, China's leaders were clearly deeply disturbed by the collapse of communism elsewhere. So, despite the political clampdown, how did they continue to manage the economy? What was the strategy?
Well, Deng, Li Peng, and the new leader, Jiang Zemin, remained firmly committed to those progressive, open-door economic policies. The underlying idea seemed to be that a successful economy, leading to widespread prosperity, would eventually make people forget their desire for political change. Keep people happy, economically, basically. And for much of the 1990s, it largely worked. China experienced an incredible economic boom, leading the world with remarkable GDP growth, averaging over 11% between 91 and 96. Living standards rose fast, especially in the eastern and southern cities. This attracted huge amounts of foreign investment, and there were plenty of consumer goods available. However, and this is crucial, this prosperity wasn't evenly spread across the vast country at all.
Right, the coastal areas boomed. Jiang Zemin, who became president after Deng's death in 1997, largely continued these policies. What else defined his leadership during that period?
Public unrest did significantly decline, partly because of that economic success, yes, but also partly because of the government's continued ruthless treatment of any dissidents. Jiang also launched a major assault on corruption within the party itself. This was a strategic move on several levels. It helped appease hardliners who blamed capitalism for the rise in corruption, and it also served to silence dissidents, who often targeted corruption as a major grievance. High-ranking officials faced trials, and some were even executed for fraud and bribery. It sent a strong message.
And to further define the party's role in this new era, Jiang introduced a new ideological framework, didn't he? The three represents.
Yes, exactly. He introduced what he called the three represents in May 2000. It was basically an attempt to clarify the CCP's core concerns in this changing world. These were representing China's development and modernization, representing China's culture and heritage, and representing the interests of the vast majority of the Chinese people. Then, quite controversially, in July 2001, he announced that the party was now officially open to capitalists, entrepreneurs, business owners. The justification was their crucial role in China's recent economic success. This move also seemed to coincide with easing some restrictions on trade unions, allowing workers more room to protest things like safety issues and poor conditions within limits.
In the early 2000s, there were significant leadership changes again. What did the new leaders, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, bring to the table? Any shifts in policy?
Jiang Zemin stepped down in 2002-2003, and Hu Jintao became the new party general secretary and president, with Wen Jiabao as prime minister. This new leadership announced some important economic changes. They moved towards selling off parts of large state-owned enterprises, allowing some smaller companies to go private, though the government absolutely retained control of the major strategic industries like energy and banking. And what Lowe calls an interesting departure, in December 2003, independent candidates were even allowed to stand in some local elections in Beijing, though they were up against thousands of official party candidates, so it was perhaps more symbolic than substantive change.
And China's economic success just continued its incredible trajectory during this period, didn't it? What was its global standing by, say, 2010?
Oh, the economic success was truly astounding. It even managed to shake off the SARS virus outbreak in 2003 with strong growth, increasingly driven by domestic consumer spending, not just exports. Foreign-owned factories continued to pour in, eager to exploit the still relatively cheap labor. By 2010, the statistics are just staggering. China had become the world's largest manufacturer and exporter, the largest maker of steel, and the biggest user of energy. It played this absolutely pivotal role in the global supply chain and held immense monetary reserves, over $2.3 trillion. Its competitiveness was exporting price deflation globally, and its voracious appetite for raw materials like oil and iron ore was impacting markets worldwide. And for the average person, annual per capita income soared dramatically, both in urban and rural areas, compared to the early 80s.
While truly staggering, this rapid growth came with significant areas of concern and escalating social tensions that connect directly to people's daily lives. What were some of the persistent problems bubbling under the surface?
Yeah, prosperity was definitely not evenly spread. While urban incomes soared, millions, hundreds of millions in rural areas still struggled with relative poverty. Many lacked access to basic things like clean drinking water. This created a stark contrast with the burgeoning number of dollar millionaires in the cities. Huge inequality. The economy itself faced risks of overproduction. Lowe mentions excess steel capacity, for example. Chinese banks suffered from problems of overlending and bad debts, often linked to huge, sometimes unviable, state-led building projects. The government even had to bail out some of its largest state-owned banks in 2004 to the tune of billions. Internationally, relations with the USA were becoming increasingly strained due to economic competition and accusations about China keeping its currency, the yuan, artificially low.
And despite all this incredible economic progress, the government's stance on political change remained absolutely unwavering, right? How did they deal with public dissent during this boom period?
Absolutely unwavering is the right way to put it. Public dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. Despite China signing international agreements pledging to improve human rights, organizations like Amnesty International reported increases in the torture of dissidents, Tibetan nationalists, and members of banned religious or spiritual groups like Falun Gong. The government also clamped down heavily on internet subversion, famously persuading companies like Google and others to censor politically sensitive content within China. The Great Firewall.
As the decade progressed, discontent continued to mount, particularly among peasants again. What were their main grievances this time?
Well, peasants, who had initially benefited quite a bit from the breakup of communes, now faced new problems. They often faced heavy taxes and, critically, illegal land seizures by local governments who were often trying to offset their own debts by selling land for development. This led to a surge in protests. In 2004 alone, Lowe reports a staggering 74,000 mass incidents. That's official terminology for public protests. These covered a huge array of grievances: lack of democracy, high taxes, corruption, land grabs, environmental issues, safety scandals, you name it. The government's response was generally to step up repressive policies. By 2012, estimates suggested several million dissidents were being held in labor camps, with many reportedly tortured.
Interestingly, amidst all this repression, Prime Minister Wen Jiabao stood out. He was the only leading politician showing public sympathy for dissenters, wasn't he?
He did, yes. He publicly called for political and legal reform, respect for rights. It was quite unusual. However, many commentators, including Jonathan Fenby again, viewed Wen's performance with a degree of skepticism. Fenby suggested it might be all part of an orchestrated campaign to dangle the possibility of reform that will never be delivered, within Hu Jintao's more consensus-driven, cautious government style. Keep hopes alive without actually changing much. Yet despite these undercurrents, the economy continued to perform remarkably well on the surface. During the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, when much of the Western world was reeling, China emerged relatively unscathed. In fact, it got to the point where, in 2011, French President Sarkozy reportedly telephoned Beijing to ask for China's help in saving the Eurozone. The question on everyone's lips really became, will China save the world?
And as Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao neared the end of their term in 2012, China was certainly looking to cement its global position with ambitious future plans. This all begs so many questions about China's future trajectory at that point. Would it truly overtake the USA as the world's greatest power? Was China's unique political system actually more efficient than Western-style democracy? Some people were arguing exactly that.
Yes, figures like Francis Fukuyama argued China's one-party system enabled decisive action, avoiding the messy democratic process. George Soros even suggested China had not only a more vigorous economy, but actually a better functioning government than the United States. Strong claims. Yet many Western and indeed some Chinese observers held the complete opposite view. Critics pointed to potential deep internal weaknesses, things like a falling birth rate, massive industrial overcapacity, money wasted on vast infrastructure projects that might never pay off, and this enormous looming problem of non-performing loans in the banking system. But perhaps the most serious weakness consistently cited was those steadily increasing social tensions. The renowned Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, shortly before his arrest, famously compared China to a runner sprinting very fast, but he has a heart condition. A powerful image. Other critics highlighted the growing disparity between rich and poor healthcare access for many, and just rampant corruption. In 2011 alone, the number of collective protest incidents reportedly jumped to 180,000. Roderick McFarquhar likened China to a massive geological fault that must one day split open. And by autumn 2012, there were some ominous signs economically, too. Exports began to fall, huge stockpiles of unsold goods were reported, and many firms producing cheap clothing for export actually collapsed.
And right before that crucial 2012 leadership handover, a major behind-the-scenes power struggle unfolded, centered on this figure, Bo Xilai. What was his Chongqing experiment about, and why did it ultimately lead to his downfall?
Bo Xilai was a very charismatic and ambitious politician. As party secretary in the megacity of Chongqing, he championed a model that combined large-scale industrial development with a sort of populist ideology, emphasizing greater equality, aggressive anti-crime measures, and even encouraging more open debate within limits. The Chongqing model. This seemed for a time to gain the support of Xi Jinping, the incoming leader. But Bo made a crucial political mistake. He apparently suggested his model compared in importance to Mao's Cultural Revolution. This was a red flag to many in the leadership. When Xi Jinping seized this opening to publicly condemn the Chongqing reforms, arguing they could lead to a repeat of the Cultural Revolution's chaos. In March 2012, Bo was dramatically sacked officially on grounds of corruption. Though many analysts, like Jonathan Fenby, believe the real reason was far more political. Bo had simply become too big for his boots and was making a play for a key security position in the upcoming leadership shuffle.
So, a very dramatic prelude to the handover. In November 2012, Hu Jintao formally handed power over to Xi Jinping. China had truly transformed in the preceding decade, hadn't it? Going from the world's sixth largest economy to the second, and becoming a predominantly urban nation for the first time in its history. What were the key challenges that Xi Jinping and his new prime minister, Li Keqiang, inherited right at that moment?
They inherited an economy that, despite its size, was seen as needing significant reform, particularly regarding the inefficient state-owned enterprises, SOEs. They faced considerable and growing social unrest, largely driven by that widening gap between rich and poor, land disputes, and environmental concerns. And perhaps most critically, they faced widespread, deeply entrenched corruption within the Communist Party itself. As one research fellow, Bo Ziyu, warned presciently back in 2012, corruption within the Chinese Communist Party is so rampant, if they don't do anything about this, they will lose credibility very quickly. It could mean the collapse of the CCP as the ruling party. A stark warning right as the new leadership took charge.
What an incredible, complex, and often brutal journey China has taken since 1949. From a devastated, war-torn nation to a global economic powerhouse, all while remaining under firm communist control. That tension, that constant push and pull between economic liberalization and unwavering political repression has truly been its defining characteristic, hasn't it?
Absolutely. It's the central paradox, really. And as you, our listeners, reflect on this history, perhaps consider this. Given these deep-seated issues of inequality, corruption, and social unrest that persist, right alongside China's immense economic power, what lessons might its current and future leadership draw upon from these turbulent decades we've just discussed? Will the party's acknowledged credibility deficit, as Bozier called it, prove to be a ticking time bomb? Or will that strategy Fenby described, the orchestrated campaign to dangle the possibility of reform that will never be delivered, continued to successfully manage dissent. And perhaps bigger picture, what does China's unique, often contradictory path imply for the future of global governance models? How will it continue to shape the world we all live in? Lots to think about there.